What's cracking, everybody? I'm Joe Field, the Sarcastic Griffin, and today we're talking about The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, the first book in the Wheel of Time series. I know that I'm extremely late on this particular train, but I read it for the first time not long ago, and I had some thoughts on it. The first part of this review, I'm going to try and stay spoiler free, and then a little bit later, I will move into the spoiler zone. The basic plot of this book is a young man, Rand, and some of his friends from this small village have to go on a quest when their village is attacked, and it is believed that they are in the middle of it, that they are the potential cause, and so they have to go on a quest to find out more about who they are and why the Dark Lord wants them so badly. I'll start off by saying that I generally like the book, but I do think that there are some issues with it in general. So first, some aspects of the book that I enjoyed. I think that the world is so big and so well done. I think that there are so many aspects that I would love to explore in the world that Robert Jordan has created. And I just kind of wish there was more time to look into the specific aspects that I really liked. I think that his description specifically of setting is really well done. I greatly enjoyed it, just in general. I think some of the areas that I found a little bit lacking, I think that the plot sort of switched directions rather abruptly in the final act, which sometimes surprises can be done well and sometimes not so well. And I think that this is one of those instances where I did not think it was done very well. I think there were other plot choices, areas where certain characters were split apart, for example, and then you had to cover each of these different uh, tracks, so to speak, that I just didn't like. I don't generally like it when a narrative that's going one direction decides to split off into a bunch of smaller stories and then come back together. At least I didn't like the way that it was done in this case. I also had some issues with certain characters, which I will get into a little bit later. Um, so now, moving into the spoiler range. To be more specific, if you've read this book, then you know that Robert Jordan, well, one of the complaints that I've seen, both from booktubers and others, are with how women are handled. This is the only book that I've read so far, and I can understand that complaint, at least for a couple of the women. So, Moiraine, I don't really mind. I think she's okay. But she's also rather bland and doesn't really do anything interesting. She just seems to know stuff, and my interest in her is primarily due to her being good at doing things. That's what I think is cool about her. On the other hand, the two other main girls both seem to function on different levels of being a pain in the rear. So, Nynaeve being probably the primary culprit, and Egwene being her protege and also secondary terrible person, both had the same quality of being able to completely misinterpret whatever a person is saying in the worst possible way, and to be forceful and like petty and mean, and I just don't like it. It's terrible. Egwene constantly taking up issue with Rand, for example, just being awful to him, and oh, well, I'm not going to talk to him. Oh, you don't want me on this trip because you think I'm a girl and you think I can't handle it and all that. Well, guess what? You're completely wrong, and now I'm not going to talk to you. I'm going to give you the silent treatment. It strikes me as sort of a stereotyped way that some men look at women, which is sort of a problem, I think. Now, not all of the female characters are that way, and some I actually did find to be kind of fun, but they were mostly the like secondary and tertiary characters that I found to be the most interesting that were women. I think specifically the princess, whose name escapes me at the moment, who is met once they travel to not Berlin, Camelin. I think she's really funny. I think she's really interesting, and I think the queen is also kind of interesting in different ways. But you don't get to see them very much. You see them in like 2 chapters, and that's it. And to me, that's unfortunate. You should really like the main characters the most. On that particular note, I didn't really like any of the main characters very much at all. I thought, I mean, I think probably the one that I liked the most out of their main group initially were probably Tom, who unfortunately disappears halfway through the book. I think he was kind of interesting in his own way, and I think he had a more interesting background story than the other characters. So I think he's one of the most interesting ones, the Gleeman. And I also think Perrin is interesting in a very understated kind of way. I think it's more by comparison, honestly. Rand is very much just the farm boy. And he's not bad. He's not great. He's just kind of bland. He's there. That's his contribution, is he's there. And Mat, I actively disliked. So, I mean, Mat spent most of the book being kind of stupid. And which is funny because there's one part in particular, and this is another thing that just bothers me. It's a small detail, but it does bother me. Is at one point, I think it's either from Perrin's perspective or from Rand's perspective. I think it's Rand though, who says that Mat is actually, I think this is Perrin. Changed my mind. It says that he found that Mat was always a quick thinker, and that is not true based on anything that I have seen. There's nothing to indicate that Mat is a quick thinker. There are plenty of indications that Mat is a quick doer, that he does things without thinking about them, but being impulsive is not the same thing as being a quick thinker. A quick thinker in general is going to come up with a really good plan most of the time and be able to execute it immediately. Okay? A quick thinker is somebody who sees trouble, dives in, and knows what to do in that moment. Who doesn't have to speculate about all the different possibilities, but can act on it. Mat doesn't do that. Mat just blabs. And several times it becomes an issue in the book. And that just grates on me. Now, I like the angle that he was trying to take, which is that Mat is kind of like the prankster and the fun guy. But when you take the prankster aspects away, which is what happens, again, in the first half of the book, and then proceeds for almost another third of the book. I don't want to do the math on that. When you have a character that is that way, and you take away their most redeeming quality, it leaves you with a character who you just don't want to be around. And that was the result with Mat, is that he just kind of was, not worth it. Other characters that were interesting, and there weren't many. The Ogier character who, Loyal? Yeah, that sounds right. Loyal. I like him. He's cool. I would have liked one other detail. I probably would have liked to have a little more detail on why he looked different than the Trollocs. Just because, I mean, I understand that people will recognize him and go, oh my gosh, he's a Trolloc. But what makes an Ogier look different? Are they the same species, or are they different? Is a Trolloc smaller? It seemed like Trollocs were maybe a little bit smaller than Ogiers, but I would have liked to have seen more details. And of course, I know Trollocs come in many different shapes and sizes, which is kind of a cool feature, but I would have liked to have seen why exactly an Ogier was, what really made them different, and have that explained a bit more. It's a small detail, but yeah, there it is. I think the setting was done really well. No real complaints there. I think that there's a lot of variation. I think that I think sometimes you spend maybe a little too much time on the setting. And that's sort of a small issue ultimately. Yeah. And besides that, I think other things that kind of really stood out to me were the book in general does feel very Tolkien inspired, and inspired perhaps in the wrong ways. So some things that I've noticed, and Tolkien can pull them off really well in ways that Jordan couldn't or didn't, are things like talking about how different languages work and how different cultures work. So honestly, they mentioned probably 3 or 4 times in the book how one song had a different name in a different culture. I don't care. They went into this. He went into the specifics, like, oh, this one's called the Traveler's Muse, but over here it's called the Tinkerer's Challenge or something like that. I don't care. I just don't. Like, those are details that are so extraneous that it's not even an interesting, like, landmark to me. It's just, ugh, who cares? Certainly not me. Similarly, he kept on referencing, like, oh, this place used to be called this super long ago, and now it's called this. And when it's Tolkien doing it, it's kind of interesting. It's like you're in a museum and you're seeing cool artifacts. But when Jordan does it, it's like, I don't know, looking at somebody's family photographs or something. You know, when you didn't ask to. It's like, why? I don't want to see this. So, with that said, we'll move into the actual main thrust of this particular thing and my breakdown, which will eventually lead to a score. The first category, character. I give this category a 6. In general, I found the characters to be pretty believable and not terribly unlikable. The perspective of the main was largely bland but not annoying, which I think is important. I find that the two of the main female characters were obnoxious as single note. Villains were generally just evil bad guys who didn't really have a whole lot of interesting things going on with them. Which is okay. It's not anything to write home about, but not anything to be really upset about either. I found the side characters generally more interesting than the main characters. And it's nice having good side characters, but it's a heck of a lot better having good main characters. So, for that reason, again, character gets a 6 from me. Next category is plot. For plot, I gave this a 7. And I gave it a 7 because, for the most part, it made sense. He did a good job of keeping tension pretty high. There were moments in the book where I felt like, man, these characters have not had a chance to just sit down, take a breath, and then be able to move on to the next thing. Like, it felt like, oh my goodness, they're being chased. Okay, they get to rest. Nope, they're still being chased. And I like that aspect of it. I felt like it really kept that forward momentum going. I will say, however, that the plot, especially towards the end of the book, I would say the last quarter of the book or so, changed. The main purpose, the main stated purpose from like chapter 4 of the book, changed with only about 10 chapters left in the book. And to me, that felt abrupt and kind of annoying, because the main point of the book was to get to the specific location, and then they're like, oh no, we can't do that, actually, we gotta do something else, sorry, we're gonna skip that whole thing that we were going to do, the whole place that you've been anticipating going to, we're going somewhere else, sorry. That bugged me. And it might not bug everybody. Some people might appreciate that, oh, this big thing has changed. It didn't. It bothered me, though. And I think also as a result, again, to me, it felt like the climax was rushed. So. And also, the resolution for this big climax did not feel earned or logical, which is also a problem. Again, so that's why I gave it a 7. Setting, I gave an 8. So I think the world, he does, like I've mentioned earlier, he does a really good job of having a lot of really complex things, and I definitely got the sense that each of these different cities and towns had some sort of story associated with them, some sort of interesting reason why they were the way they were. And I love that. I love that aspect of it. I think he did a really good job as a result. Um, the setting, the setting, it's just, I don't know. I liked it. I liked the map. I liked how far they were traveling. And I liked how long it took them. So, like, it didn't feel like they were going from point A to point B, like, overnight. It seemed like, oh, no, like, on this map, they're traveling 1,000 miles. Like, and it gave a good sense of, like, how big the world was. And also how different certain areas were. So, like, the wilderness could be really wild. Smaller towns could be really homey, or they could be really problematic. Big cities could be really awesome and fun, or there could be major problems brewing within them that you either weren't aware of or became aware of. There were little subcultures. I think he did an excellent job in general with that aspect, with the setting. And I think some specific areas that stood out to me were sort of the, like, areas where bad guys were. Like, those areas seemed really intimidating. You know, they seemed scary. Places that were supposed to be dark seemed dark and menacing in their own way. And I liked them. I think the evil areas especially were fleshed out well. Although I do think that sometimes the evil corrupting things was a little overstated at times. I'm willing to let the overstatement flow. In general, again, setting was an 8. Next is engagement. Engagement, I give this a 5. So not great, not terrible, just kind of, And I mentioned before, a lot of this is tied to characters. And since the main characters were not particularly interesting to me, I didn't find them to be especially interesting. Now, there were moments where I found something one of the characters said to be funny, and I was laughing along with them. There were times when I was exhausted with them. But there weren't so many that I felt extremely engaged. I think he did an okay job, but I think that there was so much more space for me to like these characters that he didn't delve into. And for me, that I think is what warrants the 5 rating as opposed to something a little bit higher. There was so much potential, and there were so many areas where characters I just frankly did not like, that it actually brought down the overall good aspects, bringing the overall quality down to a 5, unfortunately. But again, a 5 is okay. It's not terrible. The next category is enjoyment. and I gave that a 6.5. Now, a 6.5 in this case means that I enjoyed it enough that I would want to read the sequels, and I likely will read the sequels. I am currently reading The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett, so I will be taking a little bit more time to do that, and then probably switch back over to the Wheel of Time series. But in general, like, I would say that my enjoyment was pretty good for it. A 6.5 is decent. It wasn't so. The score, in other words, reflects that I would like to read the sequels, but I feel no strong urge to do so immediately. So, as a result, like I said, I was able to switch over to a different book and read that instead. Um, I want to read the sequels, but I'm not dying to either. I wasn't like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it ended there. I need to read the next one. And to me that's okay. And it's not one of the books that I'll probably be raving about to friends. I won't be telling people, oh my gosh, The Eye of the World is my favorite book ever. I'll just be like, yeah, it's an okay book. I have to read the rest of the series to tell you whether or not it's worth reading that one to get to the others. So, the next category is world building. And as I said before in setting, which feeds a lot into world building, the world building is amazing. I give this a 9, which is a really solid score. And I think it's well deserved. Robert Jordan has woven together a really intricate world that is deep and complex, and there's a lot of different characters in it and different ideas that are being explored. And some things I think are pulled off really, really well. As I've said before, the setting alone is really worthwhile. I think that the history, the language, the different races, the locales, they all have their own interesting little details and their own different ways of existing and being. And I think that one of the things that's great is there's a moment where one of the characters doesn't look like they're from a specific region, but talks like they're from that region. And for that reason alone, a character believes them. They're like, you don't look like a person from there, but you talk like it. And so it's a lot harder to fake speech, so I'm going to believe that you're actually from the location you said you were from, even though you don't look like you're from there at all. And to me, like, that says, not everybody looks the same everywhere. Which is like, I mean, living in our world, it's like, yeah, no duh, of course. But in a lot of fantasy books, that kind of gets overlooked a little bit. Or it can be, at least. And not having everybody look exactly the same or being exactly the same or having the same cultural values strikes me as a really realistic way of having the world function. I will also say that the magic system I appreciated. Magic, it's still a little bit, I don't really understand it exactly perfectly, and I don't think I'm supposed to. It's a softer magic system, certainly, but it has its interesting quirks, and it never felt to me, well, it didn't feel like it until like towards the end of the book, honestly, but magic never felt like it was used as a Deus Ex Machina. It always seemed interesting and warranted, and it never, not, I don't want to say never again, because I said end of the book. In general, it didn't feel like it was being used just willy-nilly. And I appreciate that. I also like some of the stipulations that are placed on it, such as, like, you can't really affect yourself with your own magic if you have it. You can only affect other things with it. The idea that it all comes from one specific source. There are just some interesting aspects to it. Now, I would say that I do have one other issue here. Well, actually, I'll save that for a little bit later. But again, world building is really good. My biggest complaints with it tend to be the reason why I didn't get a 10 is because of the way that he weaves in his world building. So there were many circumstances where a character would launch into a big long story about why something is the way it is where it is, or where they would talk about extraneous details that just didn't mean anything to me, and that got a lower grade as a result. So 9 is still pretty damn good though, so that's still nothing to be upset about. Okay, so pros, I would give that a 5. I thought it was okay. I didn't think it was anything to write home about though, and there were some epic moments that, in my opinion, fell short when it came to dialogue, and similarly, epic things that felt like they were supposed to be on an epic scale felt like they fell short in general because of either the way that he was using language or how he wasn't able to explain things to a sufficient degree. So he was really good at again explaining things like setting, but when it came to just explaining a story, like telling a story, it felt like it could have been handled much better and much less boring. I think that other descriptions of like big fight scenes and things could have also been much more epic if he wrote it a little bit better. And I think also some of the dialogue wasn't really all didn't really stand out a whole lot for each individual character, with a few minor exceptions. In general, if you took away the dialogue tags, it would be very hard to tell who was talking, unless we're talking about the female characters being really mean for no good reason. Um, that's the reason why pros got a 5. Uh, Next, we have structure, which I gave a 7. Chapters and paragraphs were of good length, although some of the dialogue was strangely tagged and confusing. There was a specific moment that I can think of, and again, these are small moments, but small moments, they stick out in your mind that they're an issue. There's one particular moment where a character goes, "What? How could that be?" And then proceeds to say, and then another character interrupted. "Oh, this is what's going on. This is what I actually meant by this." But it's all in one paragraph. So there isn't "How could this be?" exclaims character A. "This is what I think." Next line from the new character, which would have made a lot more sense to me, and it had me thinking, wait, did that person actually interrupt, or is this the same person talking here, and we're just told that the person interrupted? It's a small minor point of confusion, but there are other little moments sort of like that throughout the book. Some chapters also, so another reason why structure is only a 7 and not higher, some chapters were quite a bit longer than I would have liked, and I think that he probably could have split some chapters in half, and it would have been a much faster read for me. I think for that reason, I kind of dragged my feet on finishing this book. And, it's one of those things where, like, I could have handled it if it was just a little bit shorter in the chapter department. So, again, that's why it's a 7. Um, Themes and tropes. So, I gave those a 7. I'd say that the themes are pretty self-explanatory. There's good versus evil. There is the importance of keeping your friends close. There's the chosen one trope. There's the Dark Lord, obviously. Um, Chaos versus order, all that kind of stuff. Um, some of the tropes that I find kind of funny is there's the infinite evil cannon fodder trope that happens to be in there quite a bit, and it's a staple, and I just think it's funny to observe that it's when it's there, you know, just tons and tons, a ridiculous number of minions of an evil race that are there just to be evil and menacing and to move the plot along. Um, like, yeah, it's at times it was a little bit ridiculous in my opinion. Like, oh my gosh, look at how many there are. There are literally thousands outside this city, and it's like, and nobody's noticed. It's like, okay, but how did they all get there? And even though some aspects of that are explained in the book, it still seems like there's just an infinite number of bad guys. And when there's an infinite number, it kind of lessens some of the stakes. It's like, well, we can't fight a million of them unless something really big happens. Spoiler alert, something big does kind of happen, but anyways. Oh, so, sorry, I'm looking over my notes on this. Generally, the tropes are done really well, if not exemplary. I actually had no problem with the Chosen One trope, and I usually find that one to be pretty annoying. I think that the Chosen One was actually kind of interesting because they were sort of diffused a little bit, so it was sort of like, well, want to use the Chosen One? Maybe all of you. We don't know. So, yeah. And to me, like, that actually is a much more interesting thing than like, oh, you're the single chosen one that we've been looking for all this time. It's like, no, actually, the bad guy doesn't know which one of you is the chosen one, so we're all going to have to go together. That's why all of us are going. So, oh well. And I think another aspect, so I think that part's fun. I like that a lot. I will say, however, and probably the reason why this has gotten a 7 is it has one of my most hated tropes in it. A trope that appears so frequently that, and every time I hear it, I just like want to pull my hair out, is the, I don't remember what it's called exactly, but it's the good powers with no drawbacks are bad trope. So it occurs when a character has good abilities, some sort of magic, some sort of strength, or some other powerful virtue, when they possess something like that, and they hate it. They don't want it. They want to get rid of it. They think it's evil or awful or something like that. It bugs me to no end. I hate it. That is like the worst, okay? You know who wants special abilities, magic powers, things that have no real cost to using them? Everyone. Everybody wants something special. Everybody wants to be the cool person. Everybody wants superpowers, okay? The only people who don't are the people who are generally either crazy and haven't thought about this enough, or are the people whose lives are so perfect that they have no reason to wish for anything else. Okay? But in general, the wish to be super powered is universal. Like, almost everybody wants that, okay? And I'm not saying, like, in the case of someone like mutants or something like that from, like, X-Men and stuff, where you could have something that disfigures you. You could be like Beast or something, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about having magical abilities that you could hide if you wanted to, or you could use and rewrite reality as you felt you wanted to. Okay? That's what I'm talking about. And the characters in here treat those abilities like they're awful. Why? People fear what they don't understand always strikes me as the worst kind of justification for this. And the other thing is there's already this acknowledgement that, like, the characters who can use magic are fighting against the bad guy. So if if the people with the magic abilities are fighting against the bad guys, why does everybody else hate them too? Like, if there's an acknowledgement, oh no, the Aes Sedai, who are the magical ability people, they fight the bad guy. Yeah, there's no question about that. But you still don't want to deal with them. Oh no, they're evil. They're terrible. They can do awful things. You know, like kill people and stuff. Really? The thing is, people can have magical abilities, and you can fear them because of the sort of damage they can do to you. But if there is an acknowledged cultural acceptance of those abilities that stems from the fact that they historically have been doing good things for people, even if they're manipulators, even if they are occasionally a little bit sly, okay? If there's an acknowledgement that they're still doing good work and that they have super abilities, people I think would in general like them more. I mean, they certainly wouldn't hate them, and they certainly, I mean, honestly, if you found out that your best friend could fly, but that made them fall into the specific category of person, I mean, wouldn't you want to say, that's so cool? You can fly? Yeah, by all means, learn how to fly. That's amazing. But no, this is not one of those books that does that. And that bugs me. Um, there are too many examples of books where characters are so reluctant to use their abilities. Now, this is different and handled very well in some media, but it's not handled well here. Okay? There are some cases where characters, if they do have some sort of not just a downside, but like if they have some sort of reason why they shouldn't use their abilities or a reason why their abilities could hurt them, then there's some good justification for not using it. If their abilities consistently cause them to explode and destroy large parts of civilization, yeah, I can understand why that would be a danger. But if that's not shown adequately as a counterbalance to why these abilities exist, then there's no really good reason to hate them and to think that that's a struggle. That shouldn't be a struggle. That should be like a major gift. Like, ooh, I mean, it should be the same as like trying to learn how to use a sword. You know, the way that it's treated in fantasy is like, ooh, cool. I'm gonna learn how to use a weapon. Awesome. Why isn't that the case here with magic? It should be. That's how it should be, but it's not. And so that's the reason why it only got a 7. It's because I absolutely hate that trope when it's not done well, and it's usually not done well. So at least Robert Jordan isn't alone in that. The final category is congruence, which has to do with the cover. So the cover that I was looking at, that I have, is for the mass market paperback, which has them, riding on the cover, on horses and all that stuff. And I give congruence a 7.5. I thought it was pretty good. I like the cover. I think it does a fairly good job. Excuse me. I think it does a good job of conveying what's in the book. They're traveling, and they do a hell of a lot of traveling in this book. So, them being on horses, traveling while you have Lan and Moiraine in the front, yeah, I see it. It makes sense. They're traveling at night. Yeah, they do traveling at night. That's a thing that they do. Sure. No problem with it. It's good. Um, so, that said, I'm not really a fan of the art. I didn't like the perspective looks a little bit weird. Moiraine, like, just on the cover looks just a little bit strange to me. The other characters in the back just don't seem to match up. Like, they're just, yeah, they're just small issues that I have with it, basically. And it's not the kind of art that I'm really a big fan of. I think it's a little bit dated, frankly. I don't think that... I think it was a very 80s, 90s fantasy feel. For high fantasy, epic fantasy stuff. And I'm not a big fan of it. So I thought that it did mostly well. And for that reason, again, I gave it a 7.5, which is a perfectly good score. And if you don't agree with that, you think, like, my reason for having it lowered because I just subjectively didn't like it, you're welcome to that opinion. And you can feel free to give it a 10. But ultimately what that means is the total score comes out to a grand whopping 68, which falls pretty fairly high, actually. Not super high. I think it falls well into the range of good. Good, but not great. Now, as a first book, Good but not great is acceptable. If the second book is much better. First books are oftentimes trying to find their footing and can sometimes fail as a result. And sometimes it can be really bad. But a sequel could be really good. Or sometimes a sequel could be really terrible. Although in general, when it comes to films, what seems to be the case is first one is okay, good but not great. Second one is awesome. And then the third one sucks. But that's not always the way it is with books. And that's usually not the way it is with books from what I've seen. So, that said, 68 is the score that I've given this one. It's good. Not amazing. Do I recommend it? Yes, I do recommend it, especially if you're a fan of epic fantasy. Do I recommend this as an entry-level book? No, I don't, actually. I think that there are too many areas where there are lengthy explanations for things that, especially if you're a little bit like me, a little bit like ADD, your attention is going to wander. And it's not going to be very interesting to you unless you're specifically invested in the subjects they're talking about, which is frankly kind of unlikely. Is the book worth your time if you are a more experienced reader? I would say yes. And you don't really need to take my word for it, because it is one of the most beloved fantasy series in the last 40 years. Okay? And that's saying something. Some people see it as seminal as, like, The Lord of the Rings. Okay? I may not be one of those yet, but it's worth saying that there is some cultural impact. And of course, with the show that came out, which I still have not yet seen. With that said, that concludes the review. Please feel free to put down your own thoughts on what this is, on what you think about the book. If you've read it before, or you really happen to like it, feel free to tell me what it is that you like about the book the most. If you really didn't like it, feel free to tell me about that. I'm all ears. But until next time, I am Joe Field, the Sarcastic Griffin. This has been my channel. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like. If you've got comments, questions, or concerns, feel free to leave a comment. And if you want to see more videos like this, feel free to click that subscribe button. Until next time, stay magical.